there's a stigma with C-sections that like you didn't really birth your baby, you had a surgery, or like you took the quote unquote easy way out. And just for anyone who, again, if ends up being your experience, or if you know a mom who has a C-section, like reiterate to her, tell her those comfort words, like you didn't take the easy way out. You birthed your baby. You are powerful. You're strong. You were so sacrificial in the way you give birth. Like those are all things that I think can be super encouraging to someone as they process their birth story, whether they had a planned C-section or not. I think you can still end up feeling a lot of those feels, even if it was part of your original birth plan. But that was like helpful to me later to process that, like, hey, I did give birth in a really sacrificial way, gave birth in a way that required a whole lot of surrender and a whole lot of letting go, in a way that like was ultimately like what was safest and best for me and my baby.
All right, you guys, this week we have another birth story for you. And I have with me here Elizabeth McCravy, which, as I just kind of jokingly introduced her, I was like, and we've had her on the podcast before. I feel like we have like built this entire relationship over the internet. We have never met in person, but I feel like I know her and I love her. And I know that you guys are going to love her too. I know I have sent out emails before where I have said, hey, check this out from her, because of the way that she shares her life and her stories in her podcast and in her business and on her Instagram. So I will make sure to put links for everything so you guys can connect with her and see some of her stuff as well. She talks about business, but she talks about motherhood too. And she's also a My Essential Birth student, which is like, it's just like full circle, everything that we've kind of built here. So with that, Liz, will you say hi to the audience and let's kind of introduce your birth story and I want to get into the details behind it because it's just beautiful. I got to listen to it on your podcast. I read the stories about it, your blog, and I know it's going to serve a bunch of women. So with that, will you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes. Well, I just want to say thank you to you, first of all, because your birth course really has been so impactful for me as like a 2-time mom now, and your podcast, all the things, and just talking to you about business stuff is always so fun. But yes, I'm Elizabeth and I'm a mom of 2 boys. My youngest, who we're about to talk about the birth story for, is 5 months. And then my oldest is about to be 3 years old. So they're like exactly 2.5 years apart. And I live in Nashville, been married 9 years. I'm a small business owner and I work from home, and I do things like online courses. I sell website templates, and I have a podcast, like Stephanie said, called the Breakthrough Brand Podcast. And I did share my birth story there, so it's fun to share it again from like this different perspective of talking to you about it.
Yeah, I'm so excited. So yeah, with that, let's kind of dive into some background behind your birth story. And because the story that we're going to share today, you've had 2 very different stories, so I feel like I want you to share both, but we're really going to focus on the one today. Give us a little bit of background for this one.
Yeah. So, okay, this second birth ends up in a C-section. And we can kind of like tell the story of how it gets there. But I do want to say, and Stephanie and I talked about this beforehand, but like, I know for both times that I was pregnant, I would have probably avoided a podcast episode about a C-section birth because I did not want that. And you're almost like, if you don't listen to it, you'll avoid it. And like, just don't even mention the word to me. You know, you feel that way about your provider. Like, don't even talk about it. And I definitely felt that way both times. I had a vaginal birth with my first. I had a unplanned, non-emergency, but an unplanned C-section with my second. So I just want to say, if you're kind of feeling that way, maybe as you press play on this, you're like, wait, I don't know if I want to listen to that. If you like birth stories, I would just say, give this a listen still. And I hope that you have the birth of your dreams. Absolutely. And I just want to show listeners, though, that C-sections can be a positive experience too. I know it's not always that way, just like a vaginal birth's not always a positive experience, but C-sections can be a positive experience. And even if you as a listener don't have a C-section, you will definitely know someone who does. And this hopefully can help you maybe even relate to her more in that regard. But with my first Colin, which again was like almost 3 years ago now, I was planning on an unmedicated birth center birth. And I was so thrilled about that. I was doing all the things to like make sure I could have an unmedicated birth at this birth center. And what ultimately happened though, and it was so hard and really like felt like total whiplash to me, but I risked out of the birth center when I went past my due date, and I had like a, hey, you're past your due date kind of ultrasound. And I did not get there was like a score I was supposed to get. I missed a point because he didn't practice breathe in the ultrasound. And so I went from like, oh, everything's fine. The non-stress test is fine, to like, hey, you got to go get induced right now at our partner hospital. Sorry, you can't, we won't even accept you at the birth center. Like you cannot be here anymore. You have to go get induced. And I tried for more natural induction methods, but I think honestly, I was just a bad candidate for induction at that point. Like I when nothing was working, I wasn't dilating, and I was really trying to continue to avoid interventions. But anyway, I ended up having a 44-hour labor where I got, my contractions started with Pitocin, which was so different than this second birth when I got to have contractions that were just like my body doing its thing. But those were very challenging for me. I eventually got an epidural, but it took me a really long time to like make that decision because I was just trying to like say no to all the interventions. I almost had to have a C-section that time too because he was in a position that it was just like things weren't progressing because of his position, but ultimately ended up getting an epidural, delivering vaginally, and not without tearing too, which felt like a huge blessing after such a long labor. And pushing all that felt really easy that time. But it ended up being that birth, really beautiful, humbling experience. I felt God's presence a lot in it, but it was one of those things where I'm like, felt like I did all the things to prepare and did not get to do birth the way I wanted. So that led me to like lots of different decisions the second go around. Like I felt like with that particular birth center, even they were like looking for opportunities to induce and risk out like the whole time I was with them, which I did not like. So that's even a little message of like, just because it's the birth center doesn't mean that they're going to be like they actually got acquired by a hospital during the time I was pregnant. And so I feel like they had a name change and everything. I saw a lot of that kind of like play out in my own birth of like just constantly like almost getting induced. So
yeah, that's an interesting place to be too. Like not everybody is going to see that, but I like the like where you're able to look back and say, I saw this happening just in your experience as well. I think that's important for moms to know. I even talk about, there's a difference between midwives and midwives, right? Like we kind of have this slang for these midwives out of hospital who really act as if they're birthing women in hospital, or they risk women out a lot or things like that. So I'm glad that you brought that up as well. Moving into this one, though, one of the things that we had talked about, and I know you mentioned even in the Facebook group, was conceiving. You kind of had, like you didn't have your cycle for quite some time. Will you talk a little bit about that? Because I know there are going to be other moms that this is their story.
Yeah. I saw you never know what to expect with your first, like when you'll get your period back. But for me, this feels so random to share in a podcast, but I didn't get my cycle back until 19 months postpartum. And that was because that's how long I breastfed my first. And I was like, and this is, if you are a mom who goes through this or is currently going through this, know that you like, it's so hard, but he was breastfeeding like very consistently, even as an older toddler, because he did not take a pacifier. So it was like I was his pacifier. So I think that kind of kept my cycle from coming back. But when I got it back, I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't had a cycle in like 1,000 years. It felt like I'm truly like, what even is a period anymore? I don't even know. Are these tampons expired? Who knows? Like that's literally how it felt. But then I had 2 cycles and then got pregnant again. So I feel like I was really looking forward to like tracking and like kind of figuring out like more like that whole thing, because I hadn't really done that but prior to getting pregnant the first time. But then, and we were not trying to conceive yet. We were thinking about it soon. So we were definitely like ready and open to a baby. And I feel really grateful that it happened the way it did. But yeah, it was just like, not a period for a really long time and then got pregnant again. So I feel like I literally went from like pregnancy, breastfeeding, pregnant to now breastfeeding again. So I'm like, whenever that's done, I'm like excited for a little break from all of it. Hopefully this next time.
Yeah, there are when you're having babies close together like that, it's just this long period of, it's just me being mom and all of my hormones.
Yes, exactly.
Well, we talk about kind of like your hopes for this pregnancy. So coming from the pregnancy that you and birth you experienced, what were your desires this way?
Yeah. So with last time being like, I was so hoping, like, I feel like I was just putting everything into like, I have to have an unmedicated birth, which I know that's like the parts of this second birth that were unmedicated were amazing. So I think that's like a really worthy desire. But I was like, had a bad taste in my mouth after the birth center experience, mainly because it was just like I said, that constant, like, you might risk out. I didn't say this before, but they had me schedule an induction at the hospital when I was only 37 weeks for when I was like just slightly past 40 weeks. And so I felt like this intense, like, I got to get the baby out before 40 weeks. Otherwise, I'm going to have a hospital birth. And that anxiety was just like, and the uncertainty about where I would give birth, really didn't love that. So I decided this time, like, I want to do a hospital, like from the get-go, and not mess around with a birth center. I also did consider a home birth, but ultimately ended up being like, just, after my last birth experience feeling like I might feel more comfortable in a hospital for this one. So I did want to go with a different midwife group than the one that delivered my oldest, Colin, mainly because our insurance didn't even take that hospital. So it was like, that wasn't even an option. But I didn't say that with my first, it was a midwife group too. So I had just like, it was midwife at a hospital, then the birth center was my care, also midwife. So I really like midwives, but I had a little moment where I was like, oh, well, what about like giving birth somewhere really close to home? Because there's a hospital right by our house, literally a 5-minute drive. And I know people who have given birth there. They're like supposed to be a great hospital. So I actually started off my care at that hospital and ended up deciding to transfer care when I was about 12 weeks to a hospital that is 30 minutes from our house. I'm in an area outside of Nashville that I wasn't even familiar with, but they had a midwife group that does births in the hospital. But the reason I transferred back on just like inductions, everything goes back to inductions in a way. But, I had a negative induction experience with my first. Like, I do not think I was a good candidate for induction. I do not think that I should have had to be induced, honestly. So this midwife, not the midwife group, the hospital group that is close to my house I started with, in my very first appointment, she started talking about reasons they induce. And I really quickly was like, just kind of spoke up for myself, like, hey, actually, let me tell you a little bit about my first birth. I'd rather not have an induction. She's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But just so you know, I would have induced you if you had that same situation that the birth center, like, I agree with their decision for an induction. I'm like, okay. But then I go and tour the hospital. As hospitals do hospital tours. I toured it when I was super early in pregnancy instead of towards the end. Cause I'm trying to like feel out if I want to give birth here, which that's something to just for listeners that like, often we think of hospital tours as something you do at like 36 weeks pregnant to like know where to enter and things like that. You can go in your first trimester to see if you like the hospital. So that's what I did. And they do their tours on Saturdays, and the hospital was completely empty. Like the maternity unit was just so empty. And so I asked the tour guide, who was a nurse, hey, why is it so empty? Because this hospital is known for like actually like an overpopulation problem and where they can sometimes have to turn people away. And she said it's because it's the weekend and this hospital mainly does inductions and they don't do inductions on the weekend. And I was just like, my gosh. So I was like, that was it for me. And I was like, I can't do this after my last birth experience. So just like advocating for yourself and asking the question, like I raised my hand in front of this whole group of men and women, was like, hey, why is it empty when y'all are saying you have a problem with overcrowding? So speaking up for yourself that way can be smart. But with this second birth, like I had kind of decided for myself that I was planning to get an epidural versus trying to go unmedicated, because I did have a good experience with epidural last time. Like when I got it in my first, it was not painful. I got a walking epidural actually with my first, which is something that I feel like not a lot of people talk about, but I could still have a lot of movement. I felt myself pushing and I felt as though it was a really positive experience overall. So that was something I was like, I'll do that again, given the option. But I was also like more open-minded. I think that was helpful. And everyone's personality is so different. I think some women, it might be more like, you want a medicated birth, that's just like it, no other option. And that's kind of how I was the first time. But for the second time, I think it was better for me to just be more open-minded and knowing that like anything could happen. But my biggest like prayer with it and hope, and the thing I was like talking to God about during pregnancy, was obviously for a healthy baby, but also I didn't want to be induced. I just wanted my body to go into labor on its own. And I wanted to like experience contractions without Pitocin being the like reason they were happening.
Yeah. There is so much in everything that you just said. And I just, as you're like saying it though, like for real, when you mentioned, like immediately I knew where you were headed with it was empty on the weekends. But I'm like, just hearing it out loud is so sad. You know what I mean? But yeah, like I actually love that they did it on a Saturday and that you saw that and that you were able to ask that question, because who knows if you would have gone on a Friday if they had it on a Friday, and wouldn't have noticed anything because they would have been so busy. But that is just, it's so, I feel like a lot of times when we talk about these kinds of birthings, or I'm talking about, people induce so that they get their weekends, I feel like that's such a, people think it's an old thought, that like, well, that's what they used to do, but it is so present right now. So I'm really grateful that you shared that. With this pregnancy, I would love to hear, talk to me about this pregnancy. Kind of walk me through what the pregnancy looked like for you. Did you have morning nausea, or, is there like, what did it look like just to be pregnant this time?
Yeah. So with my first, the pregnancy was really chill, generally speaking. And it was this time too, overall. But with Colin, who's my oldest, the first trimester, I did not have any morning sickness, felt totally normal, almost in like a freaky way. I was like, am I really pregnant? Which was scary for me. And I had a lot of fear, which I know like a lot of listeners can probably relate to that. It can be scary being pregnant. You're wanting everything to be okay with your baby. Morning sickness, even though it sucks, can actually be a bit of a comfort. And so I did not have that with him. And it was like such a weird thing of just like, you're not showing yet that early. And so I just did not feel pregnant. But this time it like hit me hard and I actually did have morning sickness, not like vomiting, only did like that. That only happened to me like once, but generally I was very fatigued that first trimester and just super nauseous, which was just like, again, just such a different experience, like from the get-go, kind of comparing both pregnancies. But I generally am someone who likes being pregnant. Like I feel like pregnancy, both times have come easier to me than birth has, of just like, that felt more like chill. I felt like I enjoyed like the pregnancy glow vibes. And like, even though I was super exhausted all the time, so that's like definitely part of me. You feel like you're waddling and things can feel tougher, but I felt like I enjoyed it. And I also felt like an interesting kind of creativity and work in both pregnancies. In both of them, I created a course for my business, like a new product offer, start to finish, like that almost aligned with the pregnancy. So that was really fun. So yeah, I feel like I like being pregnant. And in both of them, I was GBS positive too. But that was like the only kind of more interesting thing. Other than that, it was like, appointments were smooth. And things were going well overall.
So you mentioned GBS positive. Was there anything else unique to your pregnancy or providers even? As we're talking about that, did you switch providers at any point? Did you have anything kind of weird come up? I think even you were talking about ultrasound. I think when I was listening to your story, you had talked about some ultrasound stuff. So anything like that?
Okay, yeah, I can share about that. Yeah, so I mean, I did do the change from that first hospital that was close to our house to the hospital that was farther away that had a midwife group that just like they were actually like their literal office was within the hospital. So it's like every time I had an appointment, I was going to where I would give birth, which was like a good experience for me of just like always every time being like present to going in there. But some things that kind of happened with that during pregnancy. So this particular midwife group only does 2 ultrasounds. They do the one to like confirm pregnancy and then the one to look at the gender and all the other stuff they do at that like 20-ish week ultrasound. And they don't do any extras unless there was some sort of issue. But then, they're wanting to make sure your baby's in the right position. So like towards the end of pregnancy, every appointment I'm laying on the table, they measure your stomach and the different midwives, which I saw a different midwife every time because it's a group, which real quick on a side note with that, I feel like sometimes we overemphasize the niceness of having the same midwife or doctor every single time, but avoiding inductions can sometimes be helpful if it's a group because then it's like you're not working with one person's particular schedule. So anyway, I saw a different person every time. There were definitely some who I enjoyed the company of more than others, but generally in both births was kind of like, I don't know who's going to actually deliver the baby, and that's okay. You end up spending more time with nurses anyway. So like it was kind of different every time. But they would, they're feeling around your stomach, and every single appointment, they were like, he's head down. Oh, I feel the head. Oh, he's so low. There's the head. And so there was never any question of position, which we can, once we get to like talking about having a C-section, it was a positioning issue that ultimately was like what caused me to have a C-section. But that was the thing, is that the whole pregnancy, they kept thinking over and over again that he was head down. And I did have 2 instances though, where I almost felt like I was questioning the position when no one else was. But one time was towards the end of pregnancy, I got a prenatal massage from someone who is a body worker and also a former midwife. And so something she would kind of do if the client wanted was at the end of the massage, she kind of felt around for positioning. And I was like, oh yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective. I had a doctor's appointment the day before. They said he's head down. She told me that she did not think he was head down, but thought he was in some sort of other position. But then she was like, well, you should trust your midwife team. They said he's head down. He probably is. Things feel off to me. So that was one time someone kind of questioned it. And then when I got towards the end of pregnancy, I had the option that they did not push on me at all, which I appreciate, but I decided to get a membrane sweep, which I did not have with my first. And I was this time hoping that like, okay, I want to get labor moving a bit quicker, because last time my oldest, he was born at 41 weeks exactly after being induced. So I'm like, thinking like, okay, it'd be nice if it was a little closer to that estimated due date. And so she went to do the membrane sweep. She actually ended up not doing it because she said I had a bulging bag of waters, meaning that like it was just everything was really, really low. And now I question if it was actually bulging because it was like a foot kind of potentially like kicking in down there. But they were just like, oh, your water's bag. So was it like this last time? I'm like, no, I don't know. Like, no, it wasn't. So those are kind of two like interesting like experiences there. And that makes me wonder if like it would have been nice if I'd had an ultrasound then. But I just said no. Like no one asked me if I wanted one. I just didn't get one. Again.
Yeah, that is interesting. Okay, talk to me. Sorry, let's back up because I do like that. I feel like it's going to dive us into the birth story, and I'm so excited for that. You mentioned having a midwife team. I'm glad that you mentioned that, and that's definitely a different perspective because I do feel like it's true that many moms, and I actually would probably put myself as one of them. I get very comfortable with one person, and I'm like, please be there. But I love that you were able to like, I am actually comfortable with any of these people, and I actually think it gives me more options. I really appreciate that perspective. Who else did you have as part of your birth team?
Yeah, and well, Stephanie, that's a good point because I think that having a doula, so I had a doula as part of my birth team, but I think she was that person that I was like, I need her to be there. This is like the constant in it. Whereas with the midwives, I'm more like, I don't know who it'll be. Like ultimately, when I was in the hospital, I cycled through a few different midwives for how long I was there and people changing shifts anyway. So it was even like the person who was the midwife on call when I got there was not who was going to deliver him. But yeah, my birth team, I had a doula both births, and I just cannot recommend having that support. Like I literally could not recommend it enough. Even if you have a husband or partner who you feel like is going to be awesome and they're prepped, they watch the My Essential Birth course with you, like they've got it. I still think it's so helpful for your spouse to have that other person even to like help them better help you. And like once we got to the hospital and I'm going through contractions, like my doula, Kristen, she was hip squeezing me like every single one in a way that like my husband, I would have had no clue how to do that skill the way she was as someone who had also, she's a mom of 4. She had done births all the different ways and like she knew what she was doing. And my doula too is actually a friend of mine. So that was like an interesting experience this time. So my first birth, I had a doula who was also absolutely incredible, who I did not know prior to hiring her as a doula. And this second birth, there were a lot of things I was already like changing. I'm like, I might plan to get an epidural. I'm not doing a birth center. I'm just kind of I didn't do a chiropractor the second time after doing it the first time. So like all these different things I was kind of shifting around. And I decided like doing a different doula too. And I had actually asked her just like as a friend, knowing that she used to be a doula, but wasn't really actively doing it. I was like, do you have any doula recommendations? And she's like, actually, I'm thinking about getting back into it now that my youngest is past 1. Like, would you want me to be your doula? And at first I was like, wait, is that weird to have like a friend there for like such intense, like intimate moments? And then I ended up deciding like, well, who better like than someone who like knows me in the context of like real life. So that was really cool. So who was ultimately there was Adam, my husband, and then my doula, Kristen, and then this midwife group who I was like, I don't know who will actually be the one who delivered.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that you kind of switched it up for the next one too and included a friend in there. Did you like, just random question, but like between the two situations where like the doula that you didn't know and somebody that you did, do you have a preference or they were just both great in their separate ways?
I think they were both great in their separate ways. So yeah, I think as you like go looking for a doula, like the biggest thing is like that you feel comfortable with them. Like it should be like a bit of an interview process. If you're going through a doula group, they often will have a website where you can browse and read a bio about all of them. And so with my first, actually, I did that. I picked a doula group that I was wanting to go with. And then I went on their website, I read all their bios, and the particular doula I ended up going with, something about her bio just resonated with me. Like she was a mom of boys. I was about to have a boy. She actually used to be a mental health counselor, which my husband is a mental health counselor. She was a Christian and we shared the same faith. And so those were kind of things I was looking for. And so I think that's what matters most. It's got to be someone that you are comfortable with and that your spouse is comfortable with, because this person's going to be here for like a lot of really strange, hard, potentially like gross moments. Like it's like you need to like feel like there's someone that you can be really honest with too, of like when it's hard. Like I had some moments in this birth with Kristen, Adam, where it was just like, I felt like I was able to be really vulnerable and say like what needed to be said because I like felt really comfortable with her. So I think that's what's most important.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Let's talk about a little bit about your pregnancy preparation. So like preparation for birth, what did you do during pregnancy? And I'd love to hear if you prepared with your husband, how that went as well.
I feel like I prepared more for my first birth than I did for my second, back on just like maybe trying to do some things a little differently. But my whole pregnancy, I stayed active fitness wise. And that was something that was even a bit different. As a first time mom, I was very afraid to lift weights while pregnant because I felt like I don't know what I can do. I'm like afraid to, just certain things, like everything was like you're nervous that you're going to mess something up. And after being a second time mom, I felt like I felt more confident in the gym doing weightlifting while pregnant. I can even give a shout out to Nourish Move Love. She's a YouTube channel that's workouts, and she has lots of pregnancy workouts. So she's a great resource if you're like, I'm pregnant, I've worked out previously and I want to keep working out, but like I don't know what I can do. I did a lot of her workout videos and that gave me confidence. Like, hey, she's pregnant. She says this is good when you're in your third trimester. I'm going to do that. So that was a really like positive thing for this pregnancy. But leading up to labor, I actually started on all the labor prep stuff earlier this second time than I did with the first, which I think actually could have an impact. My second, Ethan, he was born at 40 weeks and 2 days. So basically right on that estimated due date, whereas Colin was born at 41 weeks after being induced. So this time that I started stuff earlier, but I did the red raspberry leaf tea. I did evening primrose oil. I did some Miles circuits, which are just so nice and relaxing, I think, even towards the end of pregnancy. I did breast pumping and then did the whole like saving colostrum thing. I did that both times, and I bought little syringes on Amazon. So you pump it out, do it in the little syringe, and then freezing it. And then you can kind of finger feed it to your baby when they're really little. That's really fun. So I did that. Like, I think I got about 25 milliliters of colostrum both times and saved all that and was able to, and that's milliliters, not ounces, as we think about like breastfeeding. So a lot less than, that'd be crazy. But that's something like I did both times to try to bring on labor. And I don't know that it actually did anything, but I think it was nice to like get extra colostrum. I did a lot of curb walking, sitting on a yoga ball, just as much as possible. I would do that while watching TV. I would do that while working. I would do that while bouncing my toddler, who thought the yoga ball was the most fun toy ever. What else? I got 2 prenatal massages. I did your daily exercise stuff, definitely pretty consistently with both pregnancies. The second time I did not eat a single date. I was like, no way to the dates. I ate so many of them my first that I feel like I got burned out on it. And then like going to 41 weeks, I was like, I don't even know if this really does much for my particular body. And I don't love dates. So that was something I didn't do. And then as far as like the other things, I feel like mentally, I did a lot of talking to my baby and a lot of prayer and working through journaling of like anxieties around birth. And I know you, Stephanie, teach this in the birth course, but I did that like the find it and flip it exercise quite a few times of like, I had all these stories in my head of like, if I end up having to get induced, this is what's going to happen. It's going to be awful. Like I wrote out scenarios of like, okay, if I get induced, here's what that actually could mean besides what my head is telling me it has to mean. Or if I go past my due date, realistically, what's going to happen? Because my first time it was like, they were just like, don't go past your due date was kind of like the message I got. So like realistically, okay, this midwife group is not pressuring me. They don't have an induction date on the calendar. I have appointments through 42 weeks. Like everything's going to be okay. So I think the journaling this time was more impactful even in some ways than the things like having, the red raspberry leaf tea and the primrose oil and all the then dates and things like that, like getting really mentally prepared for birth. I did that differently this time. I felt like more mentally ready for like whatever it held, more open to different ways it could look. Whereas the first time I was like, it has to look this one way and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure it does, which ultimately was not in my power. And I was told like, hey, you have to get induced and we're not going to like care for you at this birth center anymore. So I think that was really helpful. And 2 resources, even Stephanie, I could share that I think for journaling, I loved the Dear Baby Journal. It's by Duncan and Stone. You can get on Etsy or on their website, but it's a week by week prayer journal where it gives you prompts. So it's like, it's week 20 of your pregnancy. Here's a little prompt, all this room to journal. And then every month you write in this, you answer some questions like your mood this month, what was the best part, what was the hardest part, and like how you're feeling. And I just loved that, of like a space specifically to pray over my baby with these specific prompts. But I also was using it to pray over things I was working through in birth. Like I would pray for whatever I was kind of dealing with that week and using that specific journal. And I did that for both my kids. So it was like, it was funny even comparing the first pregnancy journal to the second. I would have that one out every week. I'm like, oh, I wonder what I was going through in week 24 with my first. And it was so often like the same stuff, which is funny. But yeah, those are kind of some things I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you for sharing all of that. Can we start with let's move into the birth story. But you talked about you had some pre-labor. So let's start there. And then I want to hear your birth story.
Yeah, so I had 3 distinct times where I thought it was labor, and it was ultimately not. It was like very early labor. I don't think it was quite prodromal labor, but it was like that whole concept of just like early labor, which was cool for me and annoying, because with Colin, I did not even have Braxton Hicks. Like I did not have a single contraction until I went to the hospital and they gave me Pitocin and contractions happened. So it was like such a bizarre experience for me. I feel like a first time mom in a lot of ways. I feel like, we think that like you've had a baby once, like it becomes easier and you understand all the things. I did not. I was like, what is this? What's happening? I don't know what contractions are like. Is this a real contraction? Like, I don't even know. I feel like a first time mom, but it was, exhausting and taxing a lot of those days. Like I would have contractions lasting for hours. I would use the contraction time wrap even. I had multiple times where I thought today's the day, this is it, only for it to stop and me to feel really defeated. And the first time it actually happened was 37 weeks and 2 days. I'd wrapped up all my work meetings and that night woke up to like very just intensely painful back labor contractions that were not close together, but long. And I felt awful. Like I felt nauseous. I truly felt horrible. I felt worse than when my actual labor started. Like it was just like, felt so off, and they lasted all night and then stopped at like 9 a.m. or so. And that was stressful. That would have been like a whole month ahead of when my first was born. If I'd actually gone into labor, then I did not feel like ready. I didn't feel like the bag was packed. I hadn't done my freezer meals, and stuff like that. But that sort of thing happened 3 different times. The 2 times after that were more not as painful as that, more like normal feeling. But I would just encourage any moms listening who go through that same thing, just to know that like whatever you want to call it, if you want to call it early labor, prodromal labor, Braxton Hicks, like whatever name you want to give it, your body is working towards birthing your baby. And it like is not for nothing, because it can feel like it's not the real thing. So therefore this doesn't count. And it's stupid and silly, but it is like, and I know you emphasize this, Stephanie, on your podcast when you've done episodes about this, but like your body's working. Trust your body and take it as a good opportunity to practice. Like I feel like I got some good practice of like mentally working through contractions with these like more mild early labor contractions. So anyway, it was ultimately like my body was working. And after those 3 times, I had a 4th time where it was like, I knew this was the real thing and it stuck.
Yeah. And I actually remember you posting about that in the Facebook group, and I had commented on it because you were like, I just feel like is it going to start? And I can't tell. And always from my perspective, I'm like, I cannot, like, I have to give you guys the long game. You know what I mean? Because I'm like listening to the information and stuff, but I'm like, there's a good chance that you have a little bit more to go. But I think what's excellent about that, and I had wondered, and I checked back the next morning and you hadn't like commented or posted, and I'm like, she probably went into labor. But what's interesting about what you did and like reaching out during that time is there is something about like when we talk about like positive affirmations or things like that, like when we put things out into the universe or however you want to say it, when we say it out loud, there's so much power in that. And so it was the very same thing with me with my second. And I had called my, she was actually my like birth educator, and she was also a doula. And I was like, I've been laboring like this for this amount of time and whatever else. And I can't tell if my body's going to go into labor, and I'm so exhausted and all this stuff. And it's like, as soon as you kind of like get that out, your body can be like, okay, let's go. And so maybe you can speak to that a little bit, what that was like, feeling kind of all over the place with it. And then when it settled in, but there is something physically that happens, and it's with your mind too. Like there is something mental, and those things, when those connect, it's like, okay, switch is turned on and all of a sudden it's go time. So did you have an experience, or can you kind of speak to the experience that you had feeling kind of like, is this it? Is it not it? And then realizing, okay, this is the real thing, or watching it switch over.
Yeah. And yes, you're right. That's like, Yes, I almost forgot that I posted in the Facebook group. You're right. I wrote like a long, detailed thing where I'm like, what's happening? Is this real? What is this called? And Stephanie's like, you're going to be okay. And that was so kind of you. You even sent me like an Instagram DM, like giving me like more advice on it. Yes. And you're right that I think like speaking it out and having like voicing it, voicing your frustrations about it. Because it's like this weird in between, right? Like I was still working a little. I mean, I'm a business owner, so I did not have like a distinct like employer-based maternity leave like start date, but I didn't feel like doing anything. It's like I have all this time on my hands because I've mostly wrapped up work things. My toddler is at preschool 3 days a week, so on like a day he's at school, I have the day to myself. But I didn't want to do anything. I just wanted the baby to be born. So I'm like, I could use this time to like do more birth prep stuff or like organize the pantry or like go on a walk or hang out with a friend. I didn't want to do any of that. I didn't want to hang out with a friend. I like wanted to be alone and have my baby. So it's like, I think just like listening to what you need at that time and knowing that like it will happen, like you will not stay pregnant forever. And it's like a lot of it is out of your hands of like when it starts, like your body knows when it's time, it's going to happen and you will like know when it's the time. And like for me, it started at 40 and 2 days. And I have this in my notes, but around 12:30 a.m., I woke up to contractions. And that had happened before, like I said, 3 times. And 2 of those 3 times were in the middle of the night. And something told me this was it. And like those first 2 times in the middle of the night, one of them I didn't even text my doula because I was like, I don't want to bother her. I don't actually think this is, I'm going to wait longer. And one of the other times I texted her, I was like, hey, Kristen, like, I don't want to bother you. I'm sorry to text you. I don't really think this is it, but I don't know. Can you help me figure it out? This time I was like, hi, Kristen, like I am in labor. And I waited like more like an hour because I was like, I'm going to kind of, keep working through this myself. But also when I woke up my husband, I was like, hey, this is really it. So it's just something about it. Like I really, like she kind of told me like, hey, you'll know when it's the real thing. And I think that might end up being true for everyone. So, don't doubt it just because you don't feel certain. But for me, it really was like, I knew this was the thing and I felt so thrilled. It felt like truly, like I said, like my biggest prayer was like, I wanted to go into labor on my own. I wanted to feel contractions just like happening naturally. And so it felt like, this is it. I'm so excited. It was like, I got that thrilling moment that you like hear about in birth stories where it's like you win the moment when you find out it's like real labor. And it was really special after not having that the first time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's neat because I know that you had said that was one of your prayers. Like, I want to go into labor on my own. Yeah. So walk us through the birth from that very first contraction that you were like, this is it, all the way through the birth.
Yeah. Okay. So like I said, I woke up my husband, texted my doula, but also I was planning, like I wanted to labor at home. That was even like another element of it, which obviously you don't need to go to hospital immediately. There's all that stuff about like, making sure contractions are like the right length apart and all that, which again was stuff back in how like I felt like a first time mom. I had to revisit that stuff from Stephanie's content of like, when do you go to the hospital? Because I don't remember because I did not even do that last time. So it's like, I got to figure that out again. But I labored at home in our bedroom while my toddler was asleep, which was really nice. I was hoping to go into labor in the night actually, so that it could be just like not taking care of him, not like bothering him necessarily. I don't know that he would have loved seeing me in labor. So I was laboring in our bedroom and it was like, it wasn't anything fancy, right? Like our bedroom was not super clean. I didn't have cool twinkly lights. I had a little nightlight on, the lights completely dark. I had my yoga ball. I was listening to music, listening to meditations, and just kind of like using the contraction timer. I had an app, using that a little bit, but also not too much. It was just really peaceful. Like it was just like kind of me, Adam kind of coming in and out, doing some like hip squeezes or letting me like, lean over him and getting me what I needed, like more water or trying to get me to eat some food too. That was a part of it for sure. And he was like working on packing up our bags, but it was literally perfect. And so as someone like, I would say for moms listening, first time, second time mom, doesn't matter, for fifth time mom, but like after having that induction experience, which ultimately like I still feel like a lot of positivity about my first birth, but like I did not like having to get induced. The Pitocin contractions with no pain medication sucked. Like it hurt. My contractions felt like, all right, here's one. Oh my gosh, I'm gritting and bearing. This is awful. There was no room for a meditation. That was not the vibe I was in. I was more like suffering through them, honestly. And then this time I got to experience, like, I'm feeling it coming on. It's a wave I'm riding, and then it ends. And now I have a little break, and it truly felt good. And it was painful, yes, but I I feel like I can understand a little bit of women who say contractions are not necessarily painful because it is about how you approach it. So like for me in the laboring at home and when I was ultimately laboring at the hospital as well, some thoughts that were helpful to me. One was that, how's the phrasing? This contraction cannot be stronger than me because it is me. That was like a helpful thought for me of like, it's not something happening to my body. This is my body. Like my actual body is the thing doing this. It's not something happening to me. And remembering this is good pain, because when you recognize that this pain it's pain bringing you closer to your baby, if you want to call it something besides pain, like pressure or whatever else, I was just calling it pain. Like this is good pain though. This is not the kind of pain where I'm in danger. This is all good. It's natural. It's supposed to happen this way. So those thoughts were really helpful to me. But yeah, I just got in the zone. I did a lot on the ball. I did a lot standing and swaying. I got in the shower for a while. I walked up and down the stairs sideways per my doula's suggestion. And it was just awesome. And I truly felt like this was wonderful. This is what I prayed for. And it was relaxing and very empowering, even after feeling very unempowered in my first birth when contractions were happening. Like I felt weak and like, this is not like, how are other women doing this is so painful, because I also had back labor that time, and the Pitocin with no pain medication was really hard. But when you are having a naturally occurring contraction, it really is like a wave where it peaks and then dips back down, which can actually feel like, if you are aware of what's happening, that it can be more enjoyable than upsetting. So,
yeah. So you have these contractions at home, you're working with your doula and your husband. At what point did you decide to go into the hospital? And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I did that laboring at home for 5.5 hours, which feels so crazy because it did not feel like 5.5 hours. It felt more like 2 hours, maybe, like just time kind of stands still during all that. When I realized like what time, I was like, wait, how have I been doing this that long? It did not feel that way. And then we basically, I was just texting with my doula and Adam was really the one mainly texting with her, but keeping her updated on like how close contractions were and things like that. She lives 10 minutes away from us, so that was really convenient as well. So she was like, whenever you're ready for me to come over, I will come. But I felt like I was enjoying laboring without like anyone's help except for Adam. And so she ended up coming at that like 5.5 hour point. And then my mother-in-law also was the person we were waiting to come to take care of my oldest while I was in labor, while we were at the hospital. And so she had a 2.5 hour drive from where she lived. So that was like a thing too, that we needed like at least 3 hours from when we told her to come before we needed to go to the hospital. So we weren't leaving Colin alone, obviously. And that all worked out beautifully. Like I feel like as a second time mom, the best thing you can hope for is going into labor in the night and your support person who's coming to take care of your other children, like to be able to come and just be there when they wake up. And I had everything like set up for her, ready to go. It was actually her birthday. So she shares a birthday with my second, and she woke up I texted her really early once I realized I was labor. I'm like, hey, I'm in labor. Also, happy birthday. Can you like drive here now? So that was how she spent her birthday, which she said was like the best way she could have spent it. So that's special. But yeah, around 6 a.m. that day. So after like, again, 5.5 hours ish, Kristen came, we went to the hospital. We got to leave in time before like school traffic and commuter traffic, because again, it was like a 30-minute drive. And that was all good. The car ride went well. And then I checked in, went into triage, which was an experience I hadn't had before, because getting induced, you don't go through all that. And that was like, it honestly felt like whiplash a little bit, because I had such a like pleasant time laboring at home, and I felt so at peace, and like everything was just going really smoothly. But then it took it through triage and check-in, all the things, 2.5 hours before they got us to a room checked in. And that was just like, that 2.5 hours felt more like 5.5 hours, whereas the time at home felt more like 2 hours. So that was not fun. That was a very long experience where I was just like, when am I going to get to my room? I'm ready to feel like settled somewhere. I probably also like made a lot less progress during that time, just because I was so like disoriented, people asking you questions and, you know, doing cervical exams and like putting you on the monitoring, all those things. And then we finally got to our room, and I started the first round of the GBS antibiotics. I did like choose to do that. And really for a long time, I was just like working through contractions with Adam and Kristen, both like supporting me and helping. Kristen, like I said, did a lot of counter pressure that was like amazing. Every time contraction, I'm like, counter pressure. And this is something that like, I'd be even curious your thoughts on this, Stephanie, but I had had continuous Bluetooth monitoring. So like you're wearing it on your stomach, not hooked up in anything. So you can literally go anywhere. You can even wear it in the shower or bath. They would let you do that. But they told me with the continuous monitoring that I could take off the clip at any point that I did not want to be monitored. And I honestly kind of forgot about it, but ended up leaving it on. And it was really cool because for every contraction, because I was hooked up to something, Adam and Kristen could see on the screen that the contraction was starting because it was starting to like tell them that. And I wasn't really paying attention to what they were, but it got to a rhythm where Kristen would tell me like, okay, you're having a contraction, the contraction coming. And I was not feeling anything. And then I would start to feel it. And it was a cool thing for me back on how I just felt so much more empowered this birth. But I realized that when I was at home laboring, I thought my contractions were really far apart. So it was even like, do we need to go to the hospital yet? They still seem really far apart. But then once I got hooked up to continuous monitoring, we realized I was just not feeling the beginning of the contraction. So they actually were longer and closer together than what it appeared at home. It was just like, you don't feel the very beginning. So that was kind of cool of like, okay, like I'm handling this even better than I realized. Like I'm not even like really noticing it at first. But yeah, so I left that on and we had, just a lot of time in that room with nurses checking in on us, not as frequently as they should have, which is something like that kind of becomes part of that C-section story. But I was just like doing that like ocean wave analogy of just like working through the contractions. And that was a whole lot of time, honestly, of the birth experience that really feels fuzzy because it felt like not much interesting was happening. It was just us in the room. I did not know what time it was. I didn't know how long I'd been there. I was still eating some as I felt hungry to eat. And I had a few different dilation checks after the one at triage and was progressing. I know at triage, I was like, I want to say 4 centimeters dilated, and then ultimately got to 7 or 8 centimeters when they ended up kind of realizing it might need to be a C-section. But Stephanie, I can share about this too before we talk more about the C-section part. But I started having back labor really bad at one point, and that was like just all of a sudden like a shift of like, oh, that hurts. This does not feel good anymore. Like, because back labor is really, really painful, I think. So I started having back labor and our nurse had me do all these different positions laying in the bed with a peanut ball that basically I was holding each one for like 20 minutes. And then she'd come back and like have me move to the next one. And I feel like I instinctually shouldn't have done it because I did not feel good. And I was asking like, oh, I hate this. This holding this position felt so bad. But it was like, she was trying to help us move it from back labor and change his position. And I've wondered if his position changed during that time of doing all those moves that were so, so painful for me to hold. But I did end up like just doing what she asked and like holding the different positions and ultimately did stop having back labor through that time.
Wow. That's really interesting to hear. And what was your doula's take on that? I'm so curious. Was she like, just let's work through it or what?
Yeah, I feel like she was like, she didn't love it. One thing she said, so at this point, I did not have any pain medication. I didn't do nitrous oxide. I didn't have an epidural or anything like that. So she commented that the thing the nurse was having me do is common positions for women who've had an epidural because it was just all laying down and super passive where I was feeling like, I want to get up. I want to move. I want to walk. Like, but prior to that, I'm like, I'm bouncing on the ball. I'm literally like pacing. Like that was what felt good to me. So it felt painful to be like sitting still. So that was her main comment. But yeah, I don't know. In hindsight, like, I don't know that I would have done anything differently because I understand why I made the decision to like do those different positions that I was being told would help because the back labor was really painful. But at the same time, I am like, it might have been smart to listen to my body a bit more and be like, hey, like this doesn't feel good. And I did ultimately, she was having me hold them all for 20 minutes on the like last round of them. I was like, I'm not doing it that long. And we did them more like 5 minutes. So at the beginning, the first 2 positions, I had 20 minutes each side. And then it became more like 5 minutes for the later stuff. But yeah, I did not love that part.
Okay. So, but you said ultimately the back labor did go away, which is so interesting too. And then what happened from there?
Yeah. So I was, starting to really feel the contractions, but still feeling like I was managing them well. And that was even something, the nurses were not checking on us much, neither were the midwives. And they ended up later telling me like, oh, you were doing so well. You were managing contractions well. We had other women there that day. They were really crowded that day who were not managing as well. And you had support people. So like, we weren't really checking on you, but I was generally managing contractions well, but I got to a point where I was like, oh my gosh, they were starting to take my breath away. I had some where I like let out some like a more of like a scream, not like a like high pitch, like scared scream, but like, you know what I mean? Like more of those vibes versus like the low moans where you're like handling it well. And I was also at a point where I was needing to make a decision about an epidural because it was getting to a point where like, if you want one, they're not going to be able to give it to you. And I all of a sudden got hit with like, oh my gosh, do I actually want an epidural? I had said that was part of my birth plan. The reason they kept asking me is because I told my doula I want one. I had my printed birth plan. It was a part of it. But then I was kind of like, I don't know, maybe I don't want one. Maybe I should just keep going. And, you know, birth is so interesting of like how much of it is out of our hands. Because in my mind, I was like, if I knew this was only going to be, you know, an hour or two more, then I definitely would just keep going. But if someone tells me it's going to be 10 more hours of this, I don't know that I can do that without having some medication. And also it was like we could do the, you know, dilation, effacement, and station information, but that also didn't really help me know like how much longer it actually is going to be. So I was at a moment where I was just super uncertain about the epidural and trying to make that decision. And it also, at this time, such a perfect moment. And I just, for everyone listening, tell your spouse to do this for you. Okay. So my husband, towards the end of pregnancy, he got my sweet toddler son. He made a video with him and all he did was say like, call and say this, call and say that. And it was to surprise me at a hard point in labor. He was like, I'm going to show her this video. It was like his plan. And so he's like, I have a video for you that's from Colin. And it's my son Colin saying, Mommy, you're amazing. I could literally cry talking about you're doing so wonderful. Great job working through your contractions. I love you so much. I'm so proud of you. Like it was just him saying stuff like that, like repeating after my husband. And I watched that video like 5 or 6 times. And it really was like helping me work through this hard moment in labor and even like the hard decision I was dealing with and just the exhaustion I was at. So yeah, if you have other children, like ask your husband to make you a video and he just needs to feed some lines to the kids. And if this is your first pregnancy, I would say too, if there's an impactful person in your life besides your spouse, like maybe it's your mother, your father, your sister, brother, a super close friend, ask your husband to reach out to them and have them make a little video that can be shown to you. And just the like directions can be, hey, I want to show her a video when she's at a really tough point in labor. What would you want to say to encourage her? And make those videos. Cause that was just so huge. And it also like just made me fall in love with my husband even more, which, you know, releases all those like wonderful, like, you know, oxytocin and all that. So that was a really sweet moment. But like when I was kind of struggling with this epidural decision or not, ultimately what ended up making me like, okay, like let's how am I going to make this decision? No one was giving me any advice. I wish someone would have been like, Elizabeth, just don't do the epidural. Like, or Elizabeth, you said you want one, go get one. I needed that because I was just so exhausted at this point. And looking back, you know, I thought I was making the decision between a medicated vaginal birth or an unmedicated vaginal birth. And really I was not. Like I was like at this particular hospital, it was going to be a C-section. So it was ultimately like not really a decision, but I ended up just being like, okay, to decide about the epidural, I want to do a cervical exam, which they were not making me do those. It was more just like whenever I asked for one, they would do one. And I'm like, depending on how far along I am, will help me decide on the epidural. So when they do the cervical exam, they tell me I'm between 7 and 8 centimeters dilate, which I'm like, awesome. That was a lot of progress since the last cervical exam. But they were questioning the position. And this was a nurse who did it. And all of a sudden she's like, I don't know if that's a head. This is weird. I'm not sure. And I was, yeah, like I said, between 7 and 8 centimeters dilate is what she said, 90% effaced, but the station was -2. So basically like not moving down, even though dilation was happening, which to them, the like not descending to the pelvis was like a sign that maybe the position's off. And so this was when everyone, after all these other instances in my pregnancy and then even at the hospital so far, where I felt like maybe in hindsight someone should have been questioning position, but no one was, is where they finally did. And so the nurse said that they wanted to do what's called an aggressive vaginal exam, is how they phrased it, which I'm like, yikes, that does not sound fun, right? And so they're like, we think we need to do an aggressive vaginal exam, which in hindsight, I'm like, why didn't they just go ahead and do an ultrasound? Why do they have to do a this type of vaginal exam, but they're like, it's going to be really aggressive to really figure out position. And the midwife ended up recommending a epidural. She's like, you're going to get an epidural. You should get one before this because it's going to be super painful. And then my doula as well, she had, with her fourth birth, was a home birth, and she had to have an aggressive vaginal exam for the same reason of like positioning issues. And she said it was like the most pain she'd ever been in with her life, and was like, maybe if you think you're going to get an epidural, this would be a good time. And I feel like part of me, like, it just maybe like mother's intuition kind of realized at that point that it might not go the way I'd hoped. And so like the things were changed. Like I'd had this really positive unmedicated birth up until this point, but things were about to change. And so I felt more like, let's do the epidural. Like this makes sense to me. And so I made that decision. And ultimately got an epidural at that point, which was the right decision in this context with everything that happened after.
Okay, so let's talk about that epidural, actually. So you're 7 to 8 centimeters. How close are contractions at this time?
Really, I can't remember exactly, but pretty close together. And I got the epidural 15 hours after that labor at home had started. And I don't remember how close together they were, but I do remember getting the epidural was like so different than with my first. With my first, like I said, I had a really positive epidural experience. Like I remember literally the doctor doing the needle in your back. And I was like, oh wait, did you already do it? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even feel anything. Great job. It was like, that was more the vibe. And this time it was not that vibe. The doctor made it feel kind of scary to me, honestly. And then I asked him about the concept of a walking epidural because that was what I had at the previous hospital. That was what they literally called it. And he acted like that was not a thing he'd ever heard of in his entire life as an anesthesiologist, which made me feel really stupid for even mentioning it. And in hindsight, I feel like more like confident in having mentioned that. But it was a different epidural. So I felt like truly numb from the waist down. Whereas with my first, I literally stood up after having an epidural. So it's like, which feels like, what? How is that possible? But like, that's how, and ultimately in that birth too, when I like pushed, I didn't even have to push just laying down the whole time. He ultimately did come out while I was laying on a bed inclined, but they had me moving around doing other things. I pushed in a squat position with an epidural that way. So it's just very different. So I felt that of like, oh my gosh, I literally feel nothing, which felt a lot different. And again, I feel like it was the right decision at this point because ultimately I was going to, like they do an epidural often as a way to like, to do pain medication for C-section. Yeah, that was how the epidural went.
Okay, so you have the epidural and they do this exam. Was that kind of the next thing? Like they did that right after?
Yeah, so they do the aggressive vaginal exam, which like felt truly uneventful because the epidural. Like she's like, do you feel any? I'm like, nope, I don't feel anything. So she did all that, and they very quickly. This midwife. This is the first time a midwife had even like checked on me in those 15 hours. Basically, I mean, someone had popped in at some point, but there was definitely the first vaginal exam by a midwife, but also like the first time I'd really even seen one of the midwives. But they ultimately ended up apologizing about it later. Like just to even flash forward a little bit in the story, but like when I was in the postpartum unit after delivering, the midwife and nurses all came and like did an actual apology to me for like not paying attention to me during my labor. Of like, they were like, we thought you were just fine and we didn't really, you should have had a vaginal exam done by a midwife. There should have been more like paying attention to positioning, but they very quickly through that exam realized something was off and they ordered an ultrasound and we're starting to talk about a potentially breech baby, which I was just like, it's very like upset at that idea already. And then it ultimately got more and more upset, but they started talking about breech baby. They had an ultrasound tech come in and do that. And then they had another ultrasound tech come, which I don't know why. They did one that was like a low quality ultrasound, so to speak. And they ordered another one that was more like high resolution type of ultrasound. And, the ultrasound techs are not supposed to tell you what they see. So I was like, asking, what do you see? What's going on? And she's like, I can't tell you. I have to like give this to the doctors and midwives and then they'll come talk to you. But in that second ultrasound, my doula was standing in a different position where she could see the screen. And when they left after I'm like asking this tech to tell me something they wanted, I'm like, Kristen, what did you see? Like, what did you see on the screen? She told me like, I saw her type breech presentation, like as the note. And so I felt like in that moment, like Kristen was the one who told me like, hey, like, because they were already starting to talk about C-section if the baby was breech. So it's like, it felt like she was even kind of the person that like delivered that news to me that's probably going to be a C-section, but we still weren't like saying that. And so then one of the midwives came in, a ton of nurses came in. It felt like my room was suddenly full of like all these different people, and they delivered the news. One of them, I don't know who, again, it was just felt like all chaotic to me in a sense, that he was breech and we need to do a C-section. And that was how it was like, hey, your baby's breech. We're going to do a C-section now. Like, just like very like matter of fact, here you go. And I truly lost it after being like, I feel like so like the birth had been so peaceful and I was managing it well and all those things. I truly lost it. I told them, nope, you're going to have to figure out another way. I'm not having a C-section. Thanks though, was kind of like my attitude about it. And I like was hysterically crying. And that's even a moment where I felt grateful I was not working through contractions, but had an epidural for that, because my reaction would have probably been a lot different even if I was having to deal with that as well. But I kind of told them, like, you're going to have to figure out another way. And they told me that there was not a doctor there that day that is comfortable doing breech vaginal deliveries. And also this particular breech positioning, which he was frank breech, but also like apparently like limbs just everywhere, like is what they said, like not. So yeah, just all over the place. They said that would be dangerous to deliver vaginally, which I don't even like. Part of me is like, I don't know how true some of that is. And there's a lot of like what ifs I could even think about of like, well, what if there had been a doctor there who was comfortable with a vaginal breech delivery and things like that. But ultimately, that was information I was given that like, this is not an option for you. And I feel like we went back and forth for quite a while where I'm like, but what about this? But what about that? What if we do this? I like, you know, what can we do to like just keep it a vaginal birth? And it was just like, you know, no, like, hey, you could do that. Just very much like, this is how it has to be. And, it was just, yeah, it felt like such whiplash. And I feel like it truly almost to me feels like two different births of like, there was this birth where I labored up until 8 centimeters. I'm like, I was almost there. And then this birth where like, okay, now you're having a C-section. Like it truly felt like it was the same baby, but I'm like, it felt like two different births. So a lot of whiplash of like, hey, like everything's going great to now like you might need a C-section, which is what they were telling me during the ultrasound time, to like, now you must have a C-section. We are prepping you for surgery now. So it really was just like, they told me they gave me a little bit of time to process it because it was not an emergency, which I'm grateful for, which I know some women, their C-section experience is more like you aren't even talking about it. It's like you're rushed off to like, go have a C-section. But a crazy thing that felt like, honestly, like a God thing to me in so many ways. But like with my first, I had a regular birth plan that was like my perfect little unmedicated birth plan. And then I had a C-section birth plan that I had printed and brought with me to the hospital because you're supposed to do that, right? You're supposed to have a C-section plan as well. And, in that birth, there was positioning issues as well, but he was head down. It was more like he was just like, his head was like towards my hip more. And so at one point they talked about C-section. I actually met with this surgeon who would have done the C-section, and we went over that C-section plan. And then we were going to do some things to like try to fix his positioning. And so he left and I signed paperwork to have a C-section. And he left and was like, okay, I hope you get the position right and I don't see you again. I'm like, you too. Like, thanks for, meeting. And he left. And that same printout is what I brought to this birth, and ultimately went over with now a new doctor who was a female surgeon who ended up being the one that delivered Ethan. But it was just weird to me that like, okay, that C-section birth plan that I like didn't really even put much thought into, ended up being like the one that I ultimately used. But yeah, to not like breeze over things with that processing though, like I want to say now in hindsight, which I know we'll talk about the C-section experience, but I feel so good about having had a C-section. I felt strong. I feel like it's the most strong I've ever felt in my life, honestly, like going through that process of like giving up the birth I had like felt like I worked so hard for. I'm starting to tear up and had been in labor for so long, right? So I ultimately did feel really strong. But like when I was told, hey, it's going to be a C-section after having a hard last birth and after feeling like things were going well, I literally told Adam and Kristen, my body was not made to give birth. I'm not made to do this. What's wrong with me that my babies won't just like come out correctly? Why won't they just be in the right position? Why can't I not even a medicated birth, just like a normal birth, whatever normal is? Like those were the kinds of things I was voicing. And it was so good to voice them. So like, if you go through any kind of changes in your birth that like disrupt you and make you feel like this is not what I planned and I'm mad, say it. I think back when you were saying this earlier, Stephanie, but like voicing things is so powerful. But I voiced it. I was like, my body's not made to do this. I'm mad. This sucks. Why can't I have the birth I want? And so, yeah, I felt a lot like a failure, like right beforehand. And, I had some, honestly, we prayed together, me, Adam, and Kristen. I felt like I ended up kind of having an adjustment moment. The surgeon who was going to deliver him now, she, she was so kind. I loved her. And so that was helpful. I even told her, I was like, you seem so nice. I'm like, I feel great about you delivering my baby. Like, she was so sweet. But she kind of we had some time together where she like asked me to like tell her any questions I have, what my fears were. And I voiced all those things to her and asked her questions and ended up feeling like, okay, I feel good. I feel ready to go do this. And so then, it was time to like go get the C-section.
Yeah, I previously when we had spoken, and I thought this was really wonderful. So maybe you can talk about that. But you had asked her some questions or kind of expressed your fears. And one of the things that she had said that it sounded like really put some of those fears to rest was the fact that things had gone well previously with other babies. Do you want to talk about that? I don't want to give away like the punchline for what she said to you, but
yeah, I can share that. Yeah, so I feel like this feels so heavy to say, but she asked me, as I'm crying about having a C-section, what are you afraid of? She's like, what are you really afraid of with this? And I told her I'm afraid that because of having a C-section that I will die or my baby will die, which I know those are very strong words to say, but that was truly when I was like, okay, I'm honestly going to tell you what I'm afraid of. That's what I'm afraid of. And birth is like, it's not like even a C-section necessarily that could cause it, but that's like what in my mind, I'm like, vaginal birth is the safe thing. C-section is the unsafe thing. And so, I felt even a little bit like I'm going to offend you by saying that, but she was not offended at all. And she said that she's never lost a mother or a baby in her entire career, or at this hospital at all. They had never had that happen with C-sections. So she's like, it's not going to happen on my watch today. Like, I've never had that happen before. And this is very safe. And you and your baby are going to absolutely be okay. So like hearing her say like, hey, she's never had that happen and you're going to be okay felt like very like comforting to me.
Yeah, I think every woman would need to hear that. And I think, at different times in our lives too, like how wonderful it is to hear somebody say like, you are safe and you're going to be taken care of. I think that's so wonderful. So, and I for moms who are listening, like if a C-section ends up being part of your story, I feel like I want you to hear that it's okay to ask those questions and express those things and have that conversation and to receive that, just that safety, that feeling of safety back, that it's going to be okay. You guys are going to be okay. Because in that moment, you go through so many emotions and like you've said, and is absolutely true, C-section moms are just as brave and just as strong as any other mom doing anything else in regards to labor. And in some ways, even more so, because you reach that place of, I don't have any control over this situation. I'm putting my life and this birth in somebody else's hands. And I'm sacrificing myself in this moment to be able to birth my baby in the best way possible. There's a lot, talk about surrender, right? We talk about surrender in birth. Like there's so much surrender that happens during that moment. And it is very strong. It is very brave and it is very beautiful. So thank you for sharing everything that you did with that. Can we move now into what it was like to experience a cesarean birth and kind of even the process? Like, what did you have to do? You talked about you had a little bit of time to prep and stuff, but did your husband come with you? Did your doula come with you? What did that look like?
Yeah, so they both got to come with me, which normally they don't allow a second support person in a C-section operating room. That's what this hospital told me they usually don't. But for whatever reason, they were like, sure, she can come. So they actually, both of them got prepped in like a gown, headpiece, they looked like they were the ones that were going to be operating, honestly. Like they were like fully dressed up in that way. And I don't know if they even did anything differently for me. Like I'd already got the epidural. I was on the hospital bed now, and that bed was movable, right? And everything really was calm because Ethan's vitals and heart rate and all those things had looked good the whole time, and everything looked good for me as well. So it was like not rushed, but also like, hey, like you're about to meet your baby, and like within this hour, it is going to happen now, which felt like so bizarre to me. Of like all of a sudden be like, oh my gosh, it's happening. Another thing that was tough is I was so hungry at that point because that's like too stuff I feel like people don't talk about, but like there's such an emphasis on like, will your provider let you eat when you're in labor, and how, like once you get an epidural, they're not going to let you eat. But you also reach a point where you don't want to eat anymore because you feel like kind of like off a little bit and not hungry, even if your body maybe is feeling empty in your stomach. So before getting the epidural, even I quit eating at some point because it didn't feel good to me. And now it was hitting me of like, oh my gosh, I'm so hungry. So they gave me more meds through the epidural and I got really sleepy, but was still alert-ish at this point. Because you are awake back on C-sections, like you said, so much surrender, like you're surrendering this experience to someone else. You are awake while your body is being physically cut open, which is a really bizarre experience. But they brought me in. I think they brought me in first and then brought Adam and Kristen in after that. And the three of us prayed together before we went in. And then as well, one of the midwives, whoever the one was on call at the time, who would have delivered him had it been a vaginal birth, she got to be in there with us as well and like narrating what was happening, which was really cool. So I have tons of videos from this birth and photos, so many of them, which was also fun because I did not have that with Colin. There was like hardly any of like it happening all at the end. But you can hear her in the video. She's telling me, okay, like now this is happening. Okay, you're going to feel some pressure. Okay, they're taking him out now. And it felt really peaceful. So yeah, I actually have from like timestamps on photos, Chris and Adam put on their OR outfits at 5:21 p.m. And then he was born at 5:52 p.m. So like from us being in our hospital room and them getting dressed, like, I mean, such a short amount of time. Something else that was cool about it that I wasn't really expecting is they told us like, hey, we have a Bluetooth speaker in the room. We'll play whatever you want over the room while you're giving birth. So Adam hooked up my phone to Bluetooth and my birth playlist, which was a lot of different, it's the same what I'd usually call them, just like music that's really inspiring and peaceful to me. That got hooked up to play. And ultimately, like he ended up picking, now I'm forgetting the name of the song. It'll come back to me, but he had it like playing on repeat. This one song that was like the one I had wanted Ethan to be born to. That was the same one Colin was born to. And this was something cool. I did not realize this because I was more like, you're awake, but kind of a little bit out of it during the actual C-section itself. But the song was playing, and Kristen told me after that, her and Adam both, that like all the nurses and doctors were like singing this worship song while it was playing and while they were doing the operation, which is so bizarre. Like, what are the chances that everyone knows this song and that like they're singing it? And I was like, Kristen, were they really like all singing it? She's like, they were really all singing it. Like everyone was singing the song. I'm like, that's just really cool. So like Ethan was literally born to like this beautiful worship song with a team of like doctors and nurses who were like singing along with it. And yeah, so I mean, the C-section was really fast. I felt a pressure when he came out, but they started again based on photo timestamps. They started the like operation part at 5:40, and then he was born at 5:52. So like a 12-minute process. I had no idea it was that fast. And with a scheduled C-section, it's longer because they do more like prep ahead of time before like you actually go in for the room. So it's not like you go and have a baby within an hour, but like in this situation, it was just like, once it got to be time, it was really, really super fast. And yeah, I felt a pressure when he was pulled out. And then they changed the pain medication once he was born. And so I started to be more alert again. And you can even see though in the video, there's a literal video of him being born. But the midwife says like, okay, baby's coming out now. Okay, lots of pressure. And then the doctor who delivered, she says, okay, happy birthday. And then he like, here he is. He comes out crying. And they did immediately take him to get weighed and checked. So I did not get to do immediate skin to skin, but I did get to within 10 minutes of him being born. And so that's nice. And so it was so crazy meeting him, as a second time mom. I was wondering how it would feel, especially the mom is the same gender. So like another boy. And it felt like so weird seeing him, and it felt like, oh my gosh, like this is of course what you looked like. And it just even a different kind of love than with my first, even though they both are boys. And so as a little newborn, it could seem super similar. And yeah, I just felt like my heart expand of like just loving him so much. And I actually got to hold him laying on the table. They kind of set him, the nurse was spotting him, but they set him up on my chest. And so his feet were kind of in my face, and I was just giving him kisses and holding him. And that was while they were like literally still closing me up, so to speak, from the C-section. And like I said, it was like such a surrender, but I also felt really powerful. And I think there's a stigma with C-sections that like you didn't really birth your baby, you had a surgery, or like you took the quote unquote easy way out. And just for anyone who, again, if ends up being your experience, or if you know a mom who has a C-section, like reiterate to her, tell her those comfort words, like, you didn't take the easy way out. You birthed your baby. You are powerful. You're strong. You were so sacrificial in the way you give birth. Like, those are all things that I think can be super encouraging to someone as they process their birth story, whether they had a planned C-section or not. I think you can still end up feeling a lot of those feels, even if it was part of your original birth plan. But that was like helpful to me later to process that, like, hey, I did give birth, gave birth in a really sacrificial way, gave birth in a way that required a whole lot of surrender and a whole lot of letting go, in a way that like was ultimately like what was safest and best for me and my baby.
Yeah. You definitely had me tearing up on that one. I'm just like picturing all these people that you don't know. They didn't have to be singing along. I just think of how, just like spiritually, how good God is, and what like a neat thing, like that was something that was important to you. And because of that, like it affected all these people in a way that supported you, but also affected them. And I just think it's beautiful. There's nothing like it, no matter how it happens. And the people involved, 9 times out of 10, like they're really good people. And when they come together like that, like it's just so beautiful. And I am curious too that that birth plan that you brought in, and I'm actually going to include that as a link for everybody listening today. We do have like a family-centered cesarean plan that you can just print and go and take with you. And I do tell moms to do exactly that. Do you feel like those things were honored? Was there anything like on there that you feel like, I'm so glad we had this on here, or that you recommend other moms include?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I'm trying to remember what I was on. So some things were not honored because they don't do it that way. So like one thing that was on, and I wasn't even that familiar with like what was even on it. So some of the things they were like, how do you feel about this? I was like, I don't even really know what that meant. I just put it on there. So I think that could even be a thing of like getting more familiar, which I know your course has resources on this for C-sections too, but like getting familiar with like what the decisions even are for a C-section birth. But one thing was, having it where I could see what was happening, like a clear divider. What do you call that?
The drape.
Yeah. They didn't do that. Yeah. They were just like, that's not something we do. And so I'm like, okay, that's all right. One thing was like skin to skin as soon as possible, which was something that they were like, yes, we'll do. And they definitely, I could see that being prioritized, and prioritizing breastfeeding quickly. I mean, like, within, he got to sit on my chest within like, I don't even know, like maybe 10 more minutes, I was in like the postpartum room nursing. So it was like, they still honored all that. I'm trying to think, I don't really remember all the other stuff on it, but I feel like I was more like a bit clueless even about what even options were with C-sections. But then at the same time, I feel like I liked the way it went. Like I loved having the music playing. I think that would be something like worth asking about, even if, your hospital doesn't have the Bluetooth situation. Like, just can you play a song from your phone that's like impactful to you? Because it does change the mood. Otherwise, you're just hearing like some beeping. Because like you're hearing in my videos, like you hear the music, but then there's also this like steady beeping, which is not going to feel that like encouraging and relaxing things. And if you could, like if you do have a doula there, pushing for them to be in the room, because like Chris did not take up much more space, and it's like they ended up being like, yeah, that's fine. But I think if I hadn't like kind of pushed on that a little bit more, it may not have like, she may not have been able to be in there. And something too that's random, but like they had, I'd been having to have the GBS stuff, the antibiotic, and they tried to, before going to give me the C-section, give me another round of it. And then I said like to the nurses, like, don't I not need that now that's a C-section? Because the thing is going through the vaginal canal that is like the problem with GBS that causes you to need the antibiotic. And she was like, oh wait, yeah, like you don't need it. You're right. And I'm like, yeah. So like, don't give me more antibiotic than I need. So I'm like, that's something like just a little bit of advocating for yourself. I was like, hey, I don't know that like now you're doing a C-section that I actually need another round, because they do it like every 5 hours or so. So I think I only had 2 rounds of it, but they were trying to give me a third like right beforehand.
Yeah.
So
no, that's good that you spoke up. And I mean, in their defense, like this is just like they're just going through their work day and it's time, and so we do the thing, and so it is really important that you're aware of those things so that you can have a voice and understand why you're pushing back on some things. So I'm glad you shared that. We talked just really quick. I know this episode is a little longer for you guys mothers who are listening, but I also know how useful it's going to be for so many women. So I don't mind doing that. But really quick before we jump off, I would love for you to talk about your postpartum, kind of like after baby's born, you're doing skin to skin, the breastfeeding, and even like home. Like, what did that look like for you?
Yeah, so we stayed at the hospital longer than we would have if it had been a vaginal delivery because they keep you longer for a C-section. And there's different like things they want you to like accomplish to show like you're physically ready to go home. The C-section recovery felt so intense compared to vaginal delivery. And I feel grateful that I've experienced both because I feel like I even have something to compare it to. And my vaginal delivery recovery felt really chill. Like I said, I didn't tear. I felt like kind of back to my old self a bit quicker. But with C-section, I mean, like walking's hard, coughing is hard, sitting up like without having help. You kind of figure out interesting ways to maneuver your body to like get around. Lifting's hard. I went through a bit of a phase in those first like 10 days where I was like, I'll never be normal again. But then I did heal quickly. It even feels like, and you feel back to your normal self all of a sudden. So that was really cool. Like going from like, this is never going to be normal to like, oh yeah, I feel like quite normal now at 5 months postpartum. I feel really quite normal. And something too, you know, with C-sections, you know, there's an incision right where the baby was born from. And I thought it would be a lot higher on my stomach than it actually is. It's way, way low. Like, you know, even a low cut swimsuit is not going to show it. So it's like, that's something too, just to know if you end up having a C-section, that's like a concern of like, hey, it's going to be smaller and lower than you'd expect. But yeah, I mean, I would say the early postpartum days, I had planned and hoped to do the 5-5-5 method. If you've heard of that, Stephanie, I think you've talked about it, but like there's different ways of it. But like the one I was interested in was like 5 days in bed, 5 days around the bed, 5 days around the house. And it's kind of like a slower, you know, a way to recover nicely. My doula had encouraged Adam and I to like pursue that if it was something I was interested in. She said like she did that with her fourth, but not with her other pregnancy, postpartum periods. She was just like immediately like back at it. And so before I knew I was going to have a C-section, when we were just at like one of our final doula meetings, I was like, yes, I'm doing the 5-5-5 thing. I want to relax in bed. I don't want to do laundry or dishes or anything. And then with a C-section, it was like, hey, this is actually just like what you are being told you have to do and what you physically feel like is what makes sense. Like you're going to try to walk around for like 5 to 10 minutes a day. Like that's it. So like, and there's definitely no unloading the dishwasher or doing laundry or even picking up your older child. And so when I had that kind of like forced on me, I had a bit of a moment where I was like angry and like, I know I want to go help cook dinner. I want to do this. I want to do that. And then Adam gently reminded me like, hey, remember you wanted this and like you have the rest of your motherhood journey to like also do those other things that like you're feeling like you care about doing right now. So just soak it up and like rest and relax and like take this time. And so that was a good perspective shift for me. And so when I did that, ultimately, like those early days did look a bit more like me resting and resting with my baby, a lot of like co-sleeping, him sleeping in the little snuggle me or, you know, just breastfeeding on demand. And that did feel different than my first one. The first I was feeling a bit more like, let's figure out schedules and like random stuff like that early that I ultimately quit on, but was like trying to do. And this time I was just more like, I'm just going to chill and you're going to chill with me. And so that was really good and special. And I would encourage women to like look up the 5-5-5 thing. And I think it's called 5-5-5 rule or something like that. But like look it up and tell your support people this is something you're interested in doing. And if you do have family coming to help, inform them that that's what you're doing and like soak up those moments and take the rest because you deserve it.
Yeah. Okay. So I know we're talking about cesarean birth here and but I am curious if you have anything that stands out to you from the My Essential Birth course that helped you prepare or like was your favorite part that you were able to bring into this birth experience. Because we absolutely do go over cesarean birth, but I think even as you and I had spoke before, we're like, I know that a lot of people skip that information and I know why, and it's totally fine. However, I do hope after listening to this that they won't. I hope that you will listen to some of this and kind of take that with you. But how did taking a good birth course prepare you for this situation?
Yeah. So your birth course is the best. Like I love it. It's so helpful. And so with my first, I watched the whole thing. Except for I think I might skip. We were talking about this. Stephanie and I had a call like last week talking about her C-section content, and I was like, I don't know. I might have skipped it. I'm like, I really don't remember. So, and ultimately that first time I didn't have a C-section. So it makes sense that I probably don't remember because I would not have used the information had I watched it. So I want to wish I had watched it, but I don't know if I did. And this second time I also didn't watch the C-section content, but I did revisit parts of the course to prepare for the second birth. And I also listened to your podcast a lot to prepare for it, and listening to other birth stories like this one helps you really get in the headspace of hearing like how different scenarios can go and how people handle different things. But something that's helpful for me, particularly with the course, for the second one, I would say is just like knowing the order of things and understanding just understanding birth more, like just overarchingly, it helps you advocate for yourself more. It helps you understand your options more. I think even with like the early labor stuff I experienced, like the birth course was helpful for that, of like just literally an understanding of like what's going on, versus it being like you're going through something and just kind of like winging it. I think that is something super helpful, and getting like the find it and flip it stuff was really helpful this time. Again, that's like an activity that's like, you should just pull it out and do it. Whenever it makes sense for you needing to like processing and work through fears and things. And obviously like the printables and stuff like birth plan, things like that were really helpful. And I think it's helpful for my husband of like him, especially the first time I was consuming a lot more birth content than he was. Like I was listening to the My Essential Birth podcast, like on repeat. He was not, but he did watch the birth course with me, and he listened. There were a few episodes that I sent him that was like, you have to listen to this episode. And so he would listen to those. But generally it's like the birth course was what he watched. So it's also helpful from that perspective of like, as a woman, you might be consuming a lot more birth content than your spouse. And so like having them have something to like educate them as well.
No, that's so true. It's so true. Because you've got that baby with you at all times, and you're like, give me all of the things. Like at all times, I just need to know all the things. And you forget, like, even as I teach birth, right? Like you forget what people don't know. You forget what your spouse like hasn't heard already or whatever. So I think that's good. That's good information. I love to end these episodes with your best advice for moms and best advice for dads. So what would that be?
Yeah. Okay. So for moms, 2 really practical things and 1 not practical thing. I'll keep them short, but the 2 practical: eat a hearty meal every night at dinner as you get closer to your due dates. Because like I said, even when you can eat in labor, you will not feel like eating, and you will feel stronger and more able to work through contractions when you ate a good meal the night before, because you never know when you're in the middle of the night, it might start. That's a common time for labor to start. So, and just always like being like nourished when you eat meals. So that was something I made a mistake of like the night before I went to labor. I did not eat like a big dinner, and I was like super regretting it. So that's one thing. And then prepping freezer meals and getting someone to set up a meal train for you for during postpartum is huge. Does not matter if it's your first baby or your 5th baby. Like it is just so helpful, so that you can like not have to cook those first few months. And this second go around, I don't think we cooked something like for dinner until Ethan was 2.5 months old, because between the meal train and all the freezer meal stuff, we were set. And I actually have a blog post, Stephanie, I can give you that's like my favorite postpartum freezer meals that like I used both times. I need to update it actually, but that are just like home runs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner that are really helpful. And having that meal train, like if no one's offered to make you a meal train, ask a close friend if they'd be willing to set up one for you. They will be happy to do it. If people want to bless you and help you in this season, a lot of times people just don't know how. So that's something. And then the like less practical one, but this is something I think about with both my birth stories, but God always provides, and he never wastes anything. Of just like whatever your birth experience is, just know that like he will provide for you, and none of it goes to waste. Like even right now, talking to you, Stephanie, about this C-section story, it's like, this is like it's an opportunity for me to help another mom potentially, like, and this could help someone that way. It's just like, you never know how God's going to use your birth story and how it doesn't go to waste. And then for partners, I asked my husband what advice he would give. And I was first like, come on, like this feels like almost like an annoying advice. But his advice was always encourage her more than you think, because no amount of encouragement is enough. So whatever you think is enough as a husband for your wife going in labor, it's not enough. Just encourage more and more. And in reality, I'm like, as the person receiving the encouragement, I'm like, that's true. Because with our first, I felt like he did not encourage me enough, honestly. And we ended up working through that and talking about like, okay, what is things that is encouraging to me? And so him to like use that language, that's even a conversation to have of like, talk to your spouse, like, hey, what's encouraging to you? And also lots of physical touch during labor, like all of those things were things he said of just like, do more than what you think is necessary to help her get through it.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for sharing your story. And I absolutely love the wisdom. I think this is going to bless a ton of people. So I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having us fun.
Okay, for those who are listening, I'm definitely going to, we'll put all the links for everything in the show notes. You can find Liz McCravy. Actually, will you just take a moment and tell them all your social media handles, because you are on social, and I would love for them to be able to connect with you and ask questions or whatever else too.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I would love to chat with anyone who listens to this. Yeah, so I'm at Elizabeth McCravy on Instagram and the other places. And then my website's elizabethmccravy.com. And I have a podcast, like Stephanie said, called the Breakthrough Brand Podcast. And I do talk about motherhood and work. If you're someone who wants to start a small business from home, there's a lot of content that will help you around that. Or if you're a fellow business owner already, a lot of like good working mom content.
Yeah, it's a good mix of like motherhood and life and business, and it's lovely. And then even her birth stories, like the birth stories are on your podcast, and then they're also on the blog posts as well. And I've read and listened, and they're both wonderful. So definitely go check her content out. Okay, thanks.